Welcome everyone to our webinar. Appreciate our friends at LeadSquared sponsoring this forum. My name is Jason Pfaff, Vice President at Red Ventures. I'm really excited about today's webinar for two reasons. One, we have a fantastic guest that I am very excited to either introduce to you if you're not familiar with David's work, or reintroduce to you if, as with many folks throughout higher education, you are familiar with David. I'm also excited about today's topic. We're talking about automation, and one of the things I really like about the conversation around automation right now is we have many trends, many things happening in higher education. I'm fond of saying we're in a sea change. And I think of automation as a tactic that's certainly been developed with different software platforms, different strategies, different ideas outside education as well, and something that we can help us as higher education leaders really manage the sea change that we're all in the midst of. It has been a wild and woolly few years in higher education. And as we get our minds and arms around this new world and the environment that we're all trying to navigate, automation may be a tactic that is compelling and relevant as a solution for you at your institution. Certainly been something I've worked with at the institutions I've been fortunate enough to work with. But first of all, I want to introduce our special guest, David Eby. He is the Vice President of Marketing at New England College. David, welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining us, man.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into the topic, we'd just love for you to just introduce yourself to our audience, talk about your higher education journey, your journey through enrollment and marketing, and the adventures that led you to your current role at New England College.
Yeah, of course. I've been in higher education marketing and mission senior leadership for about 25 years. I started my career on the for-profit side and spent about 10 years working in the for-profit sector. I've worked on both the OPM as a provider and as a client. And I spent 5 years at Southern New Hampshire University as the chief marketing officer there from 2010 to 2015. And after leaving there, I was the COO of a large OPM and started doing some consulting work and found some great friends at New England College and have been working with them for about 2 years almost now. So happy to be here.
Outstanding. No, it's wonderful. And you've worked with a variety of environments and types of educational offerings throughout higher education. So I think your perspective is very valuable in that you've come from the OPM space, but you've also worked at large adult serving, typical, Southern New Hampshire has a lot of online students as well, right? We're very familiar with their growth. But New England College today, which certainly has its own opportunities and challenges. So appreciate the well-rounded perspective that you bring and the background that you lend to the conversation, man.
Great, happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'd like to do as we start, as I mentioned, your background and your insight is very relevant to this conversation. Talk to me just at a high level. What you've seen, call it over the last 10 years, if you go back to when you started, maybe you mentioned Southern New Hampshire in 2010. What have you seen play out over the last 10 years as we talk about higher education landscape, specifically thinking about students, the types of students that are attending, trends and what they're looking for? How would you kind of define that as a backdrop for us?
Well, I think as everybody knows, higher education in general has become much more competitive. Over the last 10 years, everyone's playing in the online space. And so, a lot of the time students are now choosing based on the way that you interact with them during the recruitment process. They're very focused on when they get communications, how they get communicated with. What we've also seen is the introduction of a number of different channels to communicate with students. You'd send them an email or you'd place a phone call. Now we're, interacting with social media during the recruitment process, using texting, and the timing of your phone calls and your interaction has to be intentional and well thought out and timely. So I think coming out of COVID as well, we've started to see a lot of change in student behaviors on both the traditional side and on the non-traditional with the non-traditional student. So, this customized, student journey is something that, for me has become really critical. Regardless of the student type, you have to be very intentional about how you communicate, and the ability to customize those student journeys is probably something that's become very important to me in the last 4 or 5 years, even more so before then.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's forced all of us to think more strategically. I think about our student population. I know from my perspective, when I started in higher education, call it 20 plus years ago, brand, the mental model someone had at your institution was everything, and schools still do, right? But certainly everything you did from a marketing perspective was poured into, again, what we call in marketing a branding exercise, and to reinforce the image and the prestige of an institution. And we've increasingly seen, service model, your communication paradigm, and the tactics and the talent and the resources that you put into that really carry the day from a competitive perspective. And I often find myself wrestling with the concept of, which came first. Did students change, and then as institutions we had to pivot to that, or did institutions start to diversify their strategy, their service model, their communication cadence in order to attract students that they weren't previously reaching? End of the day, I don't think it really matters, but I think part of what you're saying is, because here we are, right? It's continued to evolve. It's only accelerated, and folks have a really, would you agree, almost a consumer mindset at times, and the level of service they expect. They want to be communicated with where they are in life on whatever channel makes sense to them, and they expect that out of a higher ed institution, just like they would any other service provider.
Yeah, and that's where education's become much more of a consumer product. You still have your elite institutions, handfuls of institutions that are making their admissions decisions the same way that they've always done. But the mid-sized tuition-dependent institutions, it's pretty much a level playing field across. You're competing with for students across the entire country, and that's I think a big change. It used to be that if you were a local student in Kansas, you would look at Kansas institutions only. Now you're looking at any variety of institution based on the programs that they offer, based on the price, based on how they interact, and the ability to do a search online and to find 10 institutions that offer the same program is so much easier than it's ever been. And I think also coming out of COVID, we're seeing some real changes. Even institutions that were not competing in the online space now are much more competitive in the online space, being forced to go there before COVID. Now they're saying, wait, we can do this, and we want to be more competitive. They want to launch more programs. I'm constantly getting calls from institutions to help them figure out that process. And the first place that I start is student journey mapping. How do you interact with your students? When do you interact with them? Because that's probably the biggest place you remove yourself from competition if you're not doing it well.
No, I appreciate that. It's interesting you mentioned schools rushing online, and some already had some type of presence. Most had some type of presence. Some are really doubling and tripling down. Some are, for the first time, introducing a presence. And you talked about the student journey mapping and understanding the types of students. Is there any thought, are you seeing any trend towards where the schools are wanting to compete? Meaning, there's a few things we can compete on, right? Price, location, program. Is there any theme there, or folks are just really thinking, they're coming to you, David, you tell us what's the best way to position. We're looking to grow. And almost asking you, are there programs we need to add? What do you think about our price point? Are they coming to you with those items in mind of how they want to attract students? Or are they really asking you up front to help them shape that? I call it go-to-market positioning.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the institution and how advanced they are and what they've been doing in the online space. There are a number that are saying, all right, what are the other programs? What are the offerings that we should be looking at. Let's do some competitive research to figure that out. But for the majority of them, it is what do we want the student experience to look like, and what should the student experience be, and how do we compete with some of these massive institutions out there that are operating in the same space where we don't have necessarily the resources, and technology is the solution to that. It's kind of it creates a level playing field. When you can, as a small institution, you can use the same type of technology that a larger institution is using and still create that, that customized student experience without having to put, the millions of dollars of resources that some of these larger institutions operate with.
So how are schools, or how would you recommend schools even start to identify those student populations, and how are you thinking about, and we'll walk a path here. We get into more of the tactical conversation around automation. The framework really starts with identification. You have to understand who these students are. So when it gets to like grouping, segmenting folks so that we can then put them into more of an automated experience where it makes sense, what's your thoughts there? What would you recommend folks think about with respect to placing students into groups and segments?
Well, I think it's actually extremely helpful when you're starting at the marketing level, right? Your ability to market in social media and different advertising channels. We've got a greater sense of who we're already marketing to than we've ever than we've ever had in the past. You can create a profile for a student and specifically go after that, in the social media channels. But I also think that, it does come back to, that customization, understanding the age demographics, the familiarity with technology, those types of things help you create that custom journey for students. And it's one of the things that I think, for institutions that are still struggling to figure that out, and everything is just kind of created equal, I think they'll continue to struggle with enrollments. The reality is you have people that recognize your brand, they're going to be naturally drawn to your institution. And those are great. You're always going to have those. It's how do you create new markets for yourself? How do you open up new opportunities, identify new potential students that are not already organically drawn to your brand? And I think that, in order to see real significant growth, that's what institutions are typically struggling with. We know what we're getting today. It's the people that know our brand. They live within a 50-mile radius of the institution typically. And we are going to get them regardless of how we communicate with them. It's how do we get those additional students, and how do we identify a new potential, demographic to go after.
So, and once you've walked that part of the journey and started to understand those baseline parameters, walk us through, high level, obviously, but walk us through your process, student journey mapping. And all of us know at an institution, these are very cross-functional environments where students going to be touched by multiple people at multiple points, even in enrollment. You've got a schedule and financial aid and enrollment and academics that all need to merge at some point with that student in their own experience. So talk to us about how you pull folks together. I imagine a pretty rich conversation about how an institution wants to serve students, what types of touch points are important. Talk to us about the process really to build that, and give folks some context as to the effort you take folks through in building out a map of a student journey for a particular student type.
Yeah, I mean, it's not overly complicated. It's, it's basic, but it does require a lot of work. The first thing that I typically do is, I want to see where we are today. So what is the communication? What's the timing of the communication? And we kind of lay it all out and say, all right, this is, are we flooding people with information? Are we doing too much? Are we doing not enough? And then once we understand, everything that we're doing, what's the timing of it? Does it make sense? What you'll see a lot of is, financial aid asking for the same thing, or something different than even admissions is asking for at the same time. Depending on how the institution's structured, maybe even student services or advising is involved in those conversations. And so typically what you see is a lot of outreach going to the student that could be duplicate, but it seems to be stepping on each other. And my experience with students is they're typically going to respond to one area at a time. They're not going to be able to keep all those plates spinning for themselves, especially busy working professionals. So figuring out how to get it all to work together. And then once we lay out our current process, then it's like, all right, is this what we expect? We have to look at it from a student perspective. And I think too many times institutions look at it from, well, this is what we can do, so this is what they get. And we're not thinking about it, as the student experiences the institution, right? It's in so many cases, gone are the days where a student's going to go on campus and take a tour and they're going to go from one department to the next. It's all done, through this virtual environment. And if it's not coordinated, it gives the student the impression that you kind of don't know what you're doing, and it seems all over the place. It's scattered,
right?
And that also gives them, a sense of maybe what their educational journey is going to be like once they start school. And if it seems overwhelming, it's too easy to just stop out. And what you see, especially with some of the larger institutions and a lot of the work we did at SNU, was about how do we simplify the journey? How do we make it as simple as possible for people to go through the process? We hold their hand, we support them, but as soon as it gets confusing and too complicated, they're gonna typically drop out, or they're gonna go someplace else that makes it look a lot easier.
I love this part of the conversation. For those of us that work with working adult students, especially at an undergrad level, someone going back to school, maybe they're, to speak to an archetype, maybe they're in their mid-30s, mid-40s, maybe a single parent, full-time job. And I'm just speaking to one segment. There's a reason. I tell teams all the time, there's a reason this person has not been able to pursue higher education to the degree they want to now before. And so often when that person ends up not enrolling, I feel like when you reverse engineer that, something in the process, to your point, David, what you just said, I love, you confirmed for them, it was too overwhelming. They got too much information too soon, dumped all over, 3 different people reaching out about one thing, and folks are like, oh yeah, that's why I've not been able to do this. I've got kids, I've got a job, I've got other things. I can't take, 6 calls from an auto dialer in 3 hours, and to that point, we're coming out of a world really where, and again, I'm going back 5, 10, 15 years in some cases. Some cases, folks still operate like this today, but where frequency, you're talking about communication, every meeting at the school was about frequency. How many calls, how many emails, how many texts, what's our connect rate, what's our, and that was the way a lot of schools scaled online, is just powerful frequency-based communication, just bazookas that they'd fire at people.
Yep.
And to your point, as the world has gotten smarter and more selective as consumers, as we've all got many more, it's interesting because we have so many more communication channels to get in touch with folks. We're really selective. I've got a 17-year-old. I don't know if he's had 3 phone conversations, voice-to-voice conversations in his life, right? Like, it's WhatsApp, it's messaging. My point being, I love where you get, we're talking about automation and a complex world of communication and student segments, but it's the punchline really. And you talk about the success you had at Southern New Hampshire. I mean, it's clear how well and how effective your efforts were. It really was less is more. Maybe not less, but simple, right? Keep it simple, keep it effective, keep it with the student in mind, the student's experience in mind, and think about that journey from the student's perspective. I submitted a lead on a platform testing something a couple hours ago. I've gotten, 3 calls in 45 minutes, right? Like, is that really how the world still operates? And, to your point, is that really effective? Is that simplifying it? Is that communicating with students in a way that they want to be communicated with?
Yeah, I to clarify, I think for even at SNU, we started out that way. We started out with the bazooka approach, right? We started out with the, let's hit them quick. And I still think there is a place where you want to be the first to contact if possible, right?
Right.
The reality is you still see students making selections sometimes based on whoever they build a relationship with that admissions counselor. The admissions counselor is the first one to contact them, but it can't just be over the phone now. That's not the only way that you're going to find success. And what I've seen a lot of success with is even sending a text in advance. So acknowledging not just through email that we received your inquiry, but through text saying, hey, we've gotten your inquiry. An admissions counselor will be calling you from this number shortly. That increased the contact rate, so you eliminated the need to call 3 times in 45 minutes or 3 times even the first day. You can place one call, the student knows the number you're calling from, and they're going to pick up the phone. So your ability to connect with students is much greater. They feel like, it's customized to them because, they're getting these responses early on in the process. And you're also setting an expectation for how you're going to communicate with that student throughout their journey. I think, the other piece that you have to be mindful of is, students, they have a variety of ways that they want to be communicated with and how they can be communicated with. And so, a question that I used to shy my admissions reps away from asking, which was, how would you like us to communicate with you? Because everyone would immediately default to email, and then we would never have a conversation, and you'd never be able to connect the student again, and they'd just be lost, right? But now that question actually matters. And it's meaningful. And we have fewer and fewer people saying email. They're saying, yeah, text me, or no, I'm okay with a phone call. But asking that question and creating that customized journey is something that I think helps students feel like they're having a unique experience. So they're more likely to engage with you, but they don't feel inundated with outreach. And that can be just as big of a turnoff as not outreaching at all.
Absolutely. And it's, I love the idea. And this is something I've been working on a lot lately, just asking, it's empowering to ask somebody, how do you want to enroll? How do you want to have this conversation? What works for you? And it's the way we live our life in other ways. I've joked with schools, and by the way, for clarity's sake, I appreciate you saying this earlier about kind of the one size fits all, just frequency approach. In a previous life, one of those enrollment advisors at a different institution making those calls, right? And so we've all worked through that. That's why I say it's an evolution. And to your point, speed the lead and being the first to form a connection and guide someone through some of their concerns or fears or excitement is often a very effective model. But I think the point we're developing is there's multiple ways to go about that and multiple ways to build from that initial brushstroke. And again, I think part of the message for the broader community in higher education around this is, as consumer cultures continue to advance, there is technology, there are tactics, there are proven ways of weaving some of these strategies in that maybe higher education is at least not been on the forefront of, if not a late adopter in some other cases. And I think that's part of at least what I advocate for is to really continue to think about how to use technology to simplify, to organize, and just make the most of your valuable resources and the most effective use of your time and certainly your prospective students' time. So with respect to automation, the topic of the day, how do you think about the potential for automation in the realm we're talking about? Primarily let's focus in on marketing, admissions. How much in your mind, I know it's hard to bucket, it's an almost impossible question to answer, but how much is still really dependent on people and phone calls and voice to voice, and how much can be automated really for the students' benefit to ensure that they're getting what they need when they need it? How do you think about where automation fits in that?
Well, what I try to think of is, if I can build a trigger or notification to the student and to my admissions counselor that an action has been taken, by the student, and the response to that can be done very quickly. The biggest question that, through a lot of polling of students, when they submit a copy of their transcripts or they submit, an essay for review for admission, the first thing that they want to know is, did you get it? Right. And so, little things like just acknowledgments of receipt of materials goes a long way in alleviating the concerns of students. And it also buys you a little bit of a time as an institution to be able to do the appropriate review of those materials and get back to students. And the process that I'm accustomed to and what I've helped design in a number of institutions, there's a responsibility for the student, and then there's a responsibility for the institution. And any responsibilities that we have for the institution, as much as possible, whether we're automating it back to the student in our communications with them, or we're automating something that notifies the admissions rep that an action has been taken, I consider that automation as well. That from a counselor perspective, I'm not searching for what I'm doing next. I'm being told what I need to do next because of what a prospective student has done or either failed to do. Sometimes it may be that there was a document that was due on a certain day, and that document wasn't submitted, so that warrants an outreach via text, email, or phone. And to be able to automate those types of things to for notification for counselors, you see just much higher levels of efficiency. And that's the way that I look at it is how many students can my admissions counselors reasonably interact with and handle. And without that automation, the ability to interact with with a broad number of students is really limited. And that automation helps you solve a lot of those efficiency issues. So your scalability is much greater with automation. And typically the student experience and student journey is better as well. The other thing that it does is it creates consistency in communication. Right. What I've seen in the past and what scares me is when I have admissions counselors constantly writing their own emails or communicating with students, and I don't know what's going out or what's being said. So it allows me to have control over some of those communications, to know that accurate information is being sent. It's being sent out very timely. And then there's also a notification for the counselor to follow up on that. So it becomes the best of both worlds for both the prospect and for the admissions counselor.
No, you mentioned a lot of benefits there, and I agree on all counts. I also think there's an interesting dynamic. I hadn't thought about it this way until recently, when I've gotten several institutions that have talked to me about they've had staffing challenges over the last year, right? And we've heard about this in many industries. And asking about automation, being able to do more with less, simply because they want to hire, but they've had a hard time hiring and training talent to keep up with some of the demand we've seen in the digital space. And they've talked about automation, but I love your ideas too around compliance, standardization. I think part of what standardization brings is the ability to measure and the ability to see what's working, because everybody's working in a similar way. And if we've cut a transcript request process time in half because we've automated everyone on the same process, we can see that performance improve. Talk to me about how you think about measurement, improvement. How often, is there a certain cadence, or is it more by feel? You revisit the student journeys that you've mapped out. Is it an annual exercise? Is it more frequent, less frequent? Talk to me about how you kind of continue to review performance and what expectations you give to institutions there.
Yeah, well, when I'm first launching some of the automation, I'm going to look at that on a pretty regular basis, at least weekly, to look at open rates on emails, to look at response rates to texts, how quickly are people turning around documents, things that we're asking them to do. So that's done on a pretty regular basis. Once I have an established communication strategy, typically looking at it about once a quarter. So I want to look at that data to see, are we seeing any significant changes in conversions when we start to see either the funnel improving or declining in conversion rates, from inquiry to application to enrollment, those types of things. Those are the high level KPIs that I'm looking at on a very regular basis, almost daily. But when I start to see any significant change, then the first thing I'm going to look at is the communication that we're sending out. Are we seeing different conversions or responses or reactions to those interactions? And then also, meeting with admissions counselors on a regular basis to get their feedback. What are they hearing from students in those conversations? But once it's established, it's something that I look at probably 3 or 4 times a year. But in the early stages of it, I'm looking at it very, very regularly to make sure it's having the intended desired effect that we're looking for. And that the conversion rates are at an acceptable range in the beginning.
And then you mentioned scale earlier. I think one of the interesting thoughts for folks is it's this two-part idea around, again, something like automation. You think of it as an enabling scale, right? We're able to scale because of the automation, but then you also look at that from the other side, and well, we've got all these automations, and that seems very, maybe not scary, but unknown. There's all these new processes and technology to manage. So how do you think about not only scaling the number of automated sequences maybe that you're managing an institution, but how do you do that?
Well, the first thing I think about is I want my admissions counselors who you've talked about before. It's a hard time to hire admissions counselors right now. In most places across the country that I'm familiar with, people are struggling to get good people and retain them, and so I want their time to be spent as best as possible. So if I know that I have a lower quality lead that may not convert at a high rate, I'm going to have some automated communications going out to that type of prospect before I ever have them interact with an admissions counselor. And so they kind of have to, it's this hybrid scoring type of method where I know the quality of the lead is not necessarily the same as an organic lead that has gone to my website and filled out an application. I want an admissions counselor to talk to that right away. But if someone clicked on an ad on Instagram as they're scrolling through and they gave me their information and I know that's going to convert at a lower rate, I may interact with them via text or email first, see if they're going to interact with me back in exchange, and then once they're engaging, then I'm going to engage an admissions rep in that conversation. So those types of things allow you to scale not only your spend and to do more marketing and to reach more people, but make the best use of your admissions counselor's time so that they're not just dialing to get a connection and getting hung up on all day long, but they're actually interacting with people that want to interact with them as well. And I think that is, from an automation perspective, that's one of the things that I see the greatest ability to scale, the effectiveness of my teams.
No, I appreciate that. And you talked even a little bit there about BuyIn, and again, these are all processes, even if it's automated, that we have to work with other people through, right? And it's interesting. We've got an example of what I'd call an automated flow or an automation on the screen. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, David. See if you agree. The schools I talk with, the departments I talk with about automation, the most success early on comes from the institutions that have the cleanest process going in, right? Like, because fundamentally we're remapping what you're already doing and routing it through some type of software or platform or triggered sequence. So talk to me about the process work. And again, this gets to the human nature, the cross-functional nature, multiple department heads and teams and people you've got to train. Talk to me, and feel free to use an example of how you break down that process, map that process, and gain buy-in across the institution.
Well, I'll go back to what I started with the process flow, the student journey map. That's not typically just with admissions. That's with all departments that interact with students, especially prospective students. And I want to bring the leadership from those teams together. We're going to talk through this. And one of the things that I discover as I work with a number of different institutions, you're right, the simple process typically wins out, but it's not uncommon that an institution hasn't reviewed their process for years, and that it just kind of evolved over time and morphed into, well, this is just what we do. And you get a lot of examples of, well, my student information system doesn't allow me to do this, so here's the workaround that we have. Or we're using multiple technology platforms to interact with students. And, it's not just simplicity of process, but it's also simplicity of the technology. How can you consolidate all these different technology platforms, from texting to phone to, CRM to, email, all of them, make it simple from a technology, from a user perspective. And the simpler you can make that, the better. And I will tell you, we're showing some process mapping, but, when I joined New England College, shortly after that, we went with LeadSquared because of the ability to automate those student journeys. We have 7 different, distinct student types: traditional undergrad, international grad, international on campus, international online, domestic online. And the ability to create all of those custom student journeys within a single platform was what really attracted me to it. Like it was, every single student experience was different based on who they were and what their needs were. And we were using Salesforce before. Our ability to do that with Salesforce was really, really limited. And in order to get it done with Salesforce, I had to hire a developer. I had to spend, literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to be able to customize the tool to what we needed to have done. And, you're seeing right now a journey map of how it interacts and the different channels that it interacts with. And we built something like this for each one of our different student types. So as we implemented, every single student or different student type was going to have an experience that was unique to them. And then it was really easy to get the registrar's office and student services and the academic team on board, because they were able to see what the intention of the student journey was. And it was the first time that we'd really laid it out in a process flow and said, okay, this is our desired state. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And then to be able to execute on that within a CRM tool, that every single communication type between text or phone or email was all in one single tool. In 20 years, I hadn't experienced that with the CRM before. And so, it was kind of an easy decision to say, yeah, we're going to try this out. And through the implementation process, we even created more customization, which I know the implementation team loved. But, every single interaction was really reviewed. Launching the CRM gave us an opportunity to go through and really dig in detail. Does that answer your question, Jason?
No, absolutely. Yeah. And to your point there, you get to a level of detail in your own thinking. It's a forcing mechanism as an exercise. And one of the examples, just a generic example of an automation flow here we have, but I think it brings home a good point. As we wrap up here, we've talked a lot about processes, and I was just asking about processes that we replicate in software, but there's things we can do now that either were a pain point or frustrating or that we couldn't do at all. And this example is just ensuring that a prospective student doesn't quote unquote slip through the cracks, right? We're able to better reach out in a more automated, trackable, measurable way to ensure that, in the old days, again, when I was in a cubicle with a phone, and we were running like radio ads, and and the phone number would go out and people would call, and you're trying to, and this is, by the way, back in practically the Flintstone era, but you'd have your little recipe card box, you'd fill out the index card, and as students called in when you ran your radio ad, there was absolutely nothing we could do to make sure someone doesn't fall through the cracks. There's maybe we had call waiting, but nowadays the effectiveness is not only the point-to-point communication with student. We're able, and this is just one example of the type of process where you're fundamentally working around pain points that previously existed. You're not losing as many leads. You're not missing communications or touch points. Human error is pervasive. It affects all of us. I'm guilty of that all day, every day. But when we automate it through the software, I think we can expect better performance from being able to put processes like that into place to alleviate some of that frustration.
Yeah, I mean, we've created a student journey that for graduate students, not for the undergraduate students, even our online undergraduate students, we still want to interact with them. But for graduate students that know what they're looking for, we've created a journey that, you don't have to interact with an admissions counselor if you don't want to. If you're following through and you're meeting all your deadlines and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, we have automated communication that tells the student, well, here's what you're supposed to do next. And of course, they can reach out to somebody if they want to. But if they don't want to, they can go through the process on their own and get registered for classes and be ready to go and do it really quickly. And that's not something that we had the ability to do in the past. And I would say 10 years ago, I mean, I remember the days of what you were talking about, the recipe box. So I'm old as well, but there was, you had to go from admissions counselor to admissions counselor. And, especially as I'm hiring a lot of new admissions counselors, they get up to speed at different rates, and that consistency, that automation ensures that the student is not going to suffer because of that. They're going to have a similar experience. So, agreed.
No, I love that, and thanks for giving me some company out here on the ledge, admitting to how long we've some of us have been at this, and it's been fun to watch it evolve, fun to watch folks like you have success with it, and I'm really excited to see where the tools take us next. As we've got some examples of some different types of flows here. Over time, we'll only be limited by our own creativity. And I know when we've got leaders in the space like yourself and some others, I think we're on the cusp of some pretty creative solutions. And we'll wrap there. Last question: as you look out over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, and it could be anything. Just curious as to what's on your mind. How are you thinking about the ways marketing and admissions continues to evolve? How are you positioning your institution for success? Don't need any secret sauce. Just curious as to kind of your outlook on the next few years, and certainly what you're expecting in your role.
Well, I think the student journey starts at that point of marketing, and I think more and more influencers of that decision are no longer just family and friends. It's it is social. It is people that are interacting on social media. So I think social media is going to play a more and more critical part in not just the marketing, but the admissions journey that students are going to go through. And there's ways to interact through social media, to kind of push people through the student journey. I also think that the schools that are going to stand out are the schools that are meeting students where they are. There's too much competition out there, and unless you have a very elite brand that is going to organically attract students to you, you have to remain competitive, and the best way to remain competitive is to meet students where their needs are at. And I've seen for a number of years where institutions are hesitant to make some of those changes because they don't feel comfortable with it. And the reality is that what you feel comfortable with doesn't matter as much as what the students want. And they're demanding a higher level of interaction using technology. Even traditional students are expecting an online component to their classroom now, especially coming out of COVID. As they studied online and they understood the experience and how that interacts in the classroom. So you're seeing even academics have to adjust their styles, their teaching style and pedagogy to adapt to a higher use of technology in the classroom. And I think that expectation is going to be throughout the entire student funnel. So you'll see more and more of that over the next coming years, I think.
I agree 100%, friend. I appreciate those thoughts. And hey, man, this is the best 45 minutes I'll have all week. So thank you for that. And thank you for your input here. I've learned a lot, and I know our audience has as well. So thanks, man.
Of course.
All right, David, we'll catch up soon. Thanks to everybody for attending the webinar. Thanks for LeadSquared for putting on this platform, and we'll see you all at our next session. Take care. Thanks, David.
Thank you, guys.